Even the moon hides her brightest child until the night is darkest. Ancient Lycan proverb. Prologue, the Night of Shame. The Bloodfang packhouse trembled with the sound of 1,000 voices. Laughter, jeers, the primal excitement of wolves who had scented blood in the water. Rain hammered against the stone walls like fists, as if the sky itself wept in protest of what was about to unfold within these halls. Lyra Thorne stood in the centre of a writhing circle of bodies, her small frame swallowed by the press of her own pack. She was 5'4", delicate-boned, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles down her back. Her eyes were a peculiar shade of silver grey, too pale, too strange, a trait that had marked her as different since birth. Those eyes now held a fragile hope that was about to be shattered like glass beneath a wolf's paw. She had waited for this night her entire life. The blood moon was rising, that rare celestial event when the full moon turned crimson, when the veil between worlds grew thin, when fated mates were revealed to one another across distances that should have been impossible. For an unmated female wolf, especially one belonging to a minor pack like Bloodfang, the blood moon represented destiny. It was the night when a wolf's true purpose might finally be unveiled. Lyra had never fit in. As the omega of the pack, the lowest-ranking wolf, she was expected to serve, to submit, to fade into the background. But she had always known, deep in the marrow of her bones, that she was meant for something more. Her instincts whispered it. Her wolf, a restless silver creature that prowled beneath her skin, refused to accept servitude. Tonight, she thought, everything would change. The blood moon crested the horizon, visible through the great windows of the packhouse. It hung there like a drop of blood, suspended in the darkness, impossibly large, impossibly red. And in that moment, as the crimson light washed across her skin, Lyra felt it. The mark appeared on her left shoulder. It bloomed like a brand, like silver fire, like starlight given form. The symbol was ancient, a crown intertwined with a wolf's head, wreathed in lunar crescents. It was beautiful. It was unmistakable. It was the mark of a fated mate. And more than that, it was a mark of power and destiny. For a single, perfect heartbeat, silence reigned in the hall. Then the laughter started. It began as a low rumble from the back of the crowd, then erupted into full, belly-shaking howls of mockery. The wolves closest to Lyra stepped back, their muzzles curling, their eyes reflecting the firelight like predators. The Alpha King's mate, a thick-necked male named Gareth, was the first to voice what they were all thinking, his tone dripping with disdain. Her? The moon goddess has finally lost her mind, another voice called out, and the crowd roared with agreement. Lyra's heart began to fracture. She looked down at the mark, trying to understand. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph. This was supposed to lift her from the dust, to prove that she was worth something. But the faces around her held only contempt. Her own alpha, Demon Blackthorn, pushed through the throng. He was a massive man in human form, all corded muscle and scarred skin, his eyes a burning amber that spoke to the power of his wolf. When he smiled, it was not a smile, it was a snarl. "You're cursed," he spat, his voice like gravel and poison. "No true king would mark such filth. This is a trick, a lie written on your skin by forces we cannot understand." And with those words, he raised one clawed hand, his wolf emerging part way, ready to strike, and he tore the mark from her shoulder. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't merely physical, though the sensation of flesh being ripped away sent Lyra to her knees, blood streaming down her arm. It was deeper than that. The bond, the connection that had just begun to form across impossible distance, was severed brutally. She felt it snap like a chain breaking, like half of her soul being ripped away through a gate that slammed shut. She screamed. The crowd's laughter turned into something darker, the excited howls of wolves who had witnessed a culling, the extinguishment of something weak and broken. Lyra ran. Through the halls of the pack house, out into the storm, into the rain and the darkness and the wind. Her shoulder burned. Her wolf howled in agony inside her, and her heart felt like it had been torn from her chest and left behind on the stone floor of that cursed hall. She ran until the pack house was nothing but a distant glow behind her. She ran until her legs gave out, and she collapsed in a ravine, half wolf, half human, gasping and bleeding and utterly, completely alone. The blood moon watched from above, and if the moon goddess wept for her chosen daughter, no one was there to witness it but the wolves and the rain and the endless, uncaring night. Chapter 1. The Ghost Wolf. 5 years can change a person. They can wear away the soft edges, smooth the rough ones, and transform a frightened girl into someone barely recognizable. The rogues called her the Ghost Wolf. She had no name that they knew, no face they could point to in a crowd, no fixed territory they could place her in. She appeared when packs were in crisis, a shadow on the horizon, a voice in the darkness, and she helped them survive. Then she vanished again, leaving behind nothing but confusion and gratitude. Lyra Thorne had learned to be invisible. She moved through the wastelands, the sprawling, unclaimed territories between the domains of the great packs, like smoke. She was lean now, muscular from years of hard living, her face sharp and angular from insufficient food. Her silver eyes had developed a flinty quality, as if they had witnessed things no wolf should ever have to witness. Her dark hair, once long and flowing, was now cut short and practical, and she bore scars that told stories of survival. The camp where she currently resided was tucked into a fold of mountains, hidden from casual view. 20 wolves lived here. Rogues, all of them. Wolves cast out from their packs, or wolves who had fled terrible circumstances. Wolves who had nothing and no one, until they found their way to the Ghost Wolf. She stood on a ridge overlooking the camp, her arms crossed, watching as her people moved about their morning tasks. They were organizing supplies, mending shelters, sharpening weapons scavenged from old human ruins. They worked with quiet efficiency, because efficiency kept them alive, because the Ghost Wolf had taught them that survival wasn't about strength, it was about strategy. "You're thinking again?" a voice said behind her. Lyra turned to see Kess approaching, a lithe female wolf with auburn hair and sharp cheekbones. Kess was one of Lyra's earliest recruits, a wolf who had fled her own pack after refusing an arranged mate bond. Over the years, she had become Lyra's second-in-command, her confidant, her closest thing to a friend. "Thinking is all I seem to do these days," Lyra replied, her voice quiet and controlled. "The supply runners from the Thornwood pack came back with news," Kess said, settling beside her on a flat stone. "A caravan will be passing through the Blackthorn ravine in 3 days. They're carrying medical supplies, herbs, bandages, wound salves. The kind of things that could help Mira's infected wound." Mira was a younger wolf in their camp, a girl of no more than 17 who had been attacked by a rogue hunter and left for dead. The wound had begun to fester, and without proper medical treatment, she would either lose her arm or lose her life. Lyra nodded slowly. "Can we acquire them without violence?" "No," Kess said flatly. "The caravan belongs to the Ironpaw pack. They're known for defending their cargo aggressively, but the ghost wolf is also known for achieving the impossible. Lyra closed her eyes. 5 years of living in the wastelands had taught her many things, but one lesson stood above all others. Survival required sacrifice. She had already sacrificed her identity, her future, her connection to the world she was born into. What was a little more risk? Plan the acquisition, she said, quietly. Non-lethal methods only. We take what Mira needs, and we leave no bodies behind. When the Ironpaw pack seeks revenge, I want them uncertain who to blame. Kess nodded and turned to leave, then paused. There was something else the runners mentioned. Something strange. Tell me. The Alpha King has begun a campaign to unite the scattered rogue packs. He's sending envoys, offering protection and territory rights to those who swear allegiance to him. They say he's never done anything like this before, that his wolf has been restless, that he's been having strange dreams. Lyra's body went very still. She kept her face impassive, but inside, something old and wounded stirred to life. The Alpha King, Kian Draven, the wolf whose eyes haunted her dreams every single night. She had never seen his face clearly in those dreams. They were too fragmented, too surreal. But she knew his essence, the way a wolf knows the call of its own kind across a vast distance. She knew the smell of him, smoke and pine and something wild and untamed. She knew the feel of his presence like a weight in the darkness. For 5 years, she had pretended not to know. For 5 years, she had buried that connection as deep as she could, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging the curse that had been placed upon her. I see, she said carefully. And what is the consensus among the rogues about his offer? Mixed, Kess admitted. Some want to accept, to finally have real protection. Others are wary of trading one master for another. But there's an undercurrent of excitement. The Alpha King is legendary. Wolves speak his name like a prayer. Like a prayer, Lyra thought bitterly. And what good had prayers ever done her? We'll remain independent, she said firmly. We'll build our own strength, gain our own territory, make our own way. We don't need to bow to a king. But even as she said it, a tremor of something, longing, desire, need, ran through her. Every full moon, that pull became almost unbearable. Every full moon, the mark on her shoulder, long since healed, though the scar remained faintly visible, seemed to ache with a phantom pain, as if calling to something it could never reach. She clenched her fists and looked away from the horizon. That night, as Lyra lay in her tent attempting sleep, the dreams came as they always did when the moon was full. She found herself in a space between waking and dreaming, a landscape that didn't quite exist. Great stone walls surrounded her, and somewhere in the shadows, a figure moved. She could never see his face clearly. It was as if her mind refused to let her, as if the bond that had been violently severed years ago was still trying to protect her from the pain of full recognition. But she could see his eyes. They were gold, burnished, molten gold, like watching fire dance in the eyes of something ancient and powerful. They looked at her with such hunger, such loss, such desperate seeking that her breath caught in her chest. "Where are you?" the figure whispered, and his voice was like thunder rolling across mountains. "Why can't I find you? I can feel you out there, somewhere in the darkness, but every path I follow leads only to emptiness." She tried to answer, tried to form words, but they caught in her throat. And she woke, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged animal. Outside her tent, she could see the full moon hanging low on the horizon, and somewhere, impossibly far away, She wondered if another wolf was waking from the same dream, wondering the same questions, feeling the same desperate void. She wondered if the Alpha King was restless too. Cliffhanger. A raven landed on a stone near her tent just before dawn, and when Lyra examined it, she found a message tied to its leg in the script of the ancient Lycan tongue. It read only, "The moon remembers what was broken. Return to Bloodfang. Your king seeks what was stolen. KD." Her blood turned to ice as she realized the Alpha King knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Chapter 2. The Alpha King's Curse. King Kian Drovan ruled from the Obsidian Keep, a fortress of black stone that rose from the mountains like a warning. It was the largest stronghold of the Lycan kingdoms, seat of power for all the great packs, and the place where the fate of the werewolf world was decided. And within those walls, a king was slowly going mad. "Your Majesty, you haven't slept in 3 days," General Vex said, concern evident in his gruff voice. The general was a massive wolf, scarred from 100 battles, his grey eyes sharp with intelligence. He stood at the entrance to Kian's private chambers, watching his king with barely concealed worry. Kian Draven stood at the window of his tower, looking out over the lands he ruled. In the light of day, he was magnificent, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the colour of burnished bronze and hair as black as obsidian. His human form was carved from perfection, all sharp angles and controlled power. But it was his wolf that was extraordinary. His wolf was pure silver black, massive even in a world where the largest wolves could reach the size of horses. His wolf was royalty given flesh. But that wolf was currently tearing itself apart from the inside. "Sleep is useless," Kian said, his voice rough from disuse. "I only dream of her anyway." "The woman?" Vex said. It wasn't a question. For 3 years now, the king had been tormented by the same recurring dream. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a woman's form moving through shadows, smelled a scent like rain and wild jasmine, felt a connection to something so essential that its absence was like living with a bleeding wound. "Not a woman," Kian corrected, his hands gripping the stone windowsill so tightly that hairline cracks appeared in the ancient granite. "My mate. My fated mate. But she exists somewhere I cannot reach her. She's like a ghost, like a dream that shatters the moment I try to grasp it." The Lycan law was clear. Every wolf had a fated mate, one soul chosen by the moon goddess herself to be the perfect complement to their own. For most wolves, meeting their mate was the most profound moment of their lives, a connection that transcended everything, that united them not just physically, but spiritually. The bond between true mates was so strong that it could move mountains, end wars, or drive a lone wolf to madness. Kian had felt that bond beginning to form 3 years ago. He had felt it like lightning striking through his body, like his very essence being set aflame. For one perfect moment, he had felt connected to something, someone, that made him whole in a way he had never been whole before. Then the connection had been severed, brutally, catastrophically, like having his soul torn in half. "The scouts have reported unusual activity in the rogue territories," Vex said, attempting to redirect his king's attention to practical matters. "There's a wolf organizing the scattered packs, a female they call the Ghost Wolf. She's been conducting raids against established pack supply lines, recruiting malcontents and outcasts, building an army of the disenfranchised." "A rebellion brewing," Kian said flatly. "Possibly. Or possibly a desperate attempt to create a safe place for those rejected by our society." Vex paused. "The point is, this ghost wolf is becoming powerful, influential. Your council believes she's a threat that should be eliminated. Kian's wolf stirred at this information. Something in the way Vex described this female. A wolf operating in shadows, helping the broken and cast aside, building something from nothing, called to something deep within him. But he pushed the feeling aside. He had learned long ago not to trust his instincts regarding anything that might be connected to the bond. His instincts about his mate had proven catastrophically unreliable. "Send a delegation to meet with the ghost wolf," he commanded. "Not as enemies, but as emissaries. Offer the rogue packs protection and territory within our domains. Offer them the chance to be part of something larger than survival." Vex looked startled. "Your Majesty, that's not the Council's recommendation. They believe the rogues are ungoverned and dangerous." "Then the Council is filled with cowards." Kian cut him off, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made even his generals flinch. "A wolf that has been rejected by society has nothing to lose by fighting. But a wolf that is given purpose, given respect, given a place where her gifts are valued, that wolf becomes an ally instead of an enemy. Besides," he added, moving away from the window, "the most powerful wolves often come from the places we refuse to look. Talent and strength don't care about pedigree." The king's eyes held a strange intensity, and Vex recognized it as the look of obsession. Whatever was driving Kian's restlessness, it went deeper than politics or governance. There was something almost desperate in his commands, as if he were grasping for answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. That night, as Kian lay alone in his massive stone chamber, the dreams came again. He found himself in that shadowy space between worlds, and she was there. His mate, his missing half, the piece of himself that had been stolen. He could almost see her face this time. Almost. It was like trying to look at something in peripheral vision. The moment he turned his full attention to it, it shifted away. "Please," he whispered to the darkness, to his wolf, to the moon goddess if she was listening. "Show me where she is. Help me find her. I can feel her out there, somewhere in the wastelands, and she's suffering. She's alone. Let me find her." But the dream only showed him her eyes, silver-grey eyes that held such pain, such loss, such desperate longing that his heart nearly broke from the weight of it. And in those eyes, he saw himself reflected back, a mirror image of his own anguish, his own need. "Find me," he heard himself say in the dream, and he wasn't sure if he was the one speaking, or if it was the echo of her own thoughts transmitted across the bond that wouldn't quite close, wouldn't quite die. He woke to his wolf howling inside him, a sound of such anguish and longing that the stone walls of the keep seemed to tremble with it. Kian rose from his bed and shifted. His wolf exploded into being, 12 feet of pure silver-black power and barely contained fury. He ran, out of the keep, across the mountains, into the wild. But no matter how far or how fast he ran, the hunger inside him remained. She was out there, his mate, the other half of his soul, and she was suffering, and he was helpless to reach her. Cliffhanger. As dawn broke, a rider galloped into the keep bearing news. The ghost wolf had been sighted leading a massive group of rogues toward the Blackthorn Ravine, directly toward the Ironpaw caravan. And according to the reports, she was heading straight for Kian's territory. When the king's advisors brought him the description of the ghost wolf, small, dark-haired, with silver eyes, his blood ran cold. Because those were the eyes he saw every night in his dreams. The connection blazed to life suddenly, like a door slamming open. His wolf knew. His wolf had always known. And if she was moving into his territory, if she was leading rogue packs toward his lands, then one of two things was happening. Either she was mounting an attack against him, or she was running toward him. Either way, their collision course was inevitable. Chapter 3. The War of Rogues. The Blackthorn Ravine was a place of twisted stone and shadow, where ancient rocks jutted from the earth at odd angles, and the light of day barely penetrated the depths. The Ironpaw caravan had chosen this route to move medical supplies northward, believing the path too difficult and too treacherous for bandits to intercept. They were wrong. Lyra had spent 3 days studying the ravine's geography, identifying choke points and vantage locations. She had positioned her wolves with precision, not for violence, but for control. The goal was to separate the supplies from the guards without bloodshed, a nearly impossible task that seemed to be the theme of her life. She crouched on a ridge above the caravan, watching through grey eyes as the Ironpaw wolves moved below. There were 20 guards, all of them large and well-trained, all of them armed with spears and blades. Against them, she had 30 of her rogues positioned in strategic locations, but with orders to use violence only as an absolute last resort. Beside her, Kess watched intently. "The medical supplies are in the 3 lead wagons," her lieutenant said quietly. "The wounded healer is traveling with them. They value their supplies enough to assign a pack healer to guard them personally. That's actually good news. If we can demonstrate the medical need, we might be able to negotiate instead of attack." Lyra nodded slowly. She had been thinking the same thing. The honor code among Lycan packs was strong, and even rogues could claim rights in certain circumstances. If they could frame this as a request for help rather than a theft, there might be a way through this that didn't end in blood. "I'll approach them alone," she decided. "Send a signal to the others to hold position. No one attacks unless I'm threatened." Kess grabbed her arm. "That's incredibly dangerous. The Ironpaw pack has 0 tolerance for rogues." "I'm aware," Lyra said, and there was something in her voice that had become familiar to all her followers, a certainty that bordered on fatalistic. As if she had decided long ago that her life was not her own to protect, that survival meant nothing if you sacrificed your principles to achieve it. She dropped down from the ridge and walked directly into the path of the advancing caravan. The Ironpaw guards saw her immediately. Weapons were drawn. A low growl rippled through the pack as their predatory instincts registered the presence of a stranger. More than that, a rogue, a wolf outside their pack. The lead guard, a scarred male with a missing ear and cold grey eyes, raised his hand to halt the caravan. He shifted partially, letting his wolf emerge enough that fangs extended from his jaw and his fingers became claws. "Rogue," he snarled. "You're in dangerous territory. This is Ironpaw land, and we don't tolerate thieves." "I'm not here to steal," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear. She kept her hands visible, open, non-threatening. "I'm here to make a formal request under the old laws. One wolf in my care requires medical treatment. Your caravan carries supplies that could save her life. I'm requesting that you provide those supplies in exchange for service or payment." A startled silence greeted this announcement. Asking for aid under the old laws was something rogues rarely did. It required admitting desperation, admitting need, something that most rogue packs were too proud to do. "The old laws are not for rogues," the scarred guard spat. "Rogues have no honor, no status. You have no standing to make such a request." "That's where you're wrong," a new voice said, and Lyra's heart nearly stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows of the ravine, not from her positioned wolves, but from a direction that suggested he had been tracking the caravan independently. He was tall, impossibly tall, with skin of burnished bronze and hair black as obsidian. He wore leather armor marked with the symbol of the royal house, and behind him came at least 50 wolves in formation. The Alpha King had arrived. Every muscle in Lyra's body went rigid. Her wolf, which had been dormant and controlled for so long, suddenly surged to the surface of her consciousness with a howl of recognition and desperation that nearly brought her to her knees. "Mate!" her wolf screamed inside her. "Mate! Our mate! He found us!" "No!" Lyra tried to push back, but it was like trying to hold back a landslide. The bond that had been severed so brutally 5 years ago was reigniting, flooding her system with sensations she had spent half a decade trying to forget. Recognition, connection, the feeling of finding home after 5 years in the frozen wasteland of exile. Kian Draven's eyes met hers across the distance of 20 paces, and she saw them widen with the same shock, the same recognition, the same desperate need that was tearing through her own consciousness. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply stared at each other. Then Kian turned his attention to the Iron Paw guards, and his voice dropped to that tone of absolute authority that came from being the most powerful alpha in existence. "The old laws stand for all wolves," he said coldly. "A request made in honor for aid in saving a life cannot be refused. These rogues come under the protection of the Crown. You will provide the requested medical supplies and allow them passage. In exchange, they will enter into the service of the Crown, and you will be compensated from the royal treasury. Is this acceptable?" The scarred Iron Paw guard looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at the 50 royal wolves standing at attention behind the king made it clear that argument would not be advisable. "Of course, Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing low. "We are honored to serve." "See that you do," Kian replied, and then, slowly, deliberately, he turned back to look at Lyra. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no denial possible. Recognition blazed between them like wildfire. His wolf howled inside him with relief and triumph. Her wolf wept with recognition and loss and desperate, overwhelming need. Kian took a step forward, and Lyra, every instinct screaming at her to run, did the only thing she could do. She bolted. Cliffhanger. She ran deeper into the ravine with her wolf partially shifted, her grey eyes blazing silver, her heart tearing itself apart inside her chest. Behind her, she heard the Alpha King roar, a sound of raw anguish and frustration and determination. She heard the thunder of his footsteps as he began to pursue her, heard Kess calling out in confusion. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because the moment she let him catch her, the moment she looked into those gold eyes and acknowledged what existed between them, she would have to face everything she had buried for 5 years. The pain, the rejection, the curse that had marked her as unworthy of the very thing her soul desperately needed. As she ran toward the deeper shadows of the ravine, she heard his voice calling her name into the darkness. "Lyra!" Chapter 4. The Reunion. The ruined fortress sat at the heart of the wastelands, ancient stone and crumbling walls that spoke of empires long forgotten. It was here that Lyra had established her true base of operations, the place where she trained her rogues in strategy and survival, where she planned her campaigns to help the forgotten wolves of the realm. It was also here that she had chosen to make her stand. She hadn't run blindly into the ravine. She had led the Alpha King directly to her stronghold. It was a calculated risk, perhaps suicidal, but Lyra had learned long ago that sometimes the only way forward was through direct confrontation rather than endless flight. Her 30 rogues had taken defensive positions throughout the fortress. They weren't arranged for maximum lethality, she still refused to engage in true warfare with the crown, but rather for tactical advantage. If forced to fight, they would use the terrain to equalize the disparity in numbers. The 50 royal wolves arrived as the sun reached its zenith, and for a moment that seemed to stretch eternally, the two forces stood across from each other in the ancient courtyard. Lyra stood at the center of the fortress, alone, deliberate in her isolation. Kian Draven approached alone as well, his royal guard maintaining position behind him. As he drew closer, he shifted from his human form to something between, a massive wolf-human hybrid that was neither fully transformed nor entirely human. It was a form of power, of dominance, and when Lyra saw it, her breath caught in her chest. He was beautiful, achingly, impossibly beautiful, with eyes that burned like molten gold and a presence that radiated raw authority and barely contained emotion. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your rogues cannot win against my forces. Surrender now, and I will show mercy." Lyra stepped forward, and as she did, she too began to shift. Her bones elongated, her muscles rippled beneath her skin, her eyes flared silver bright. But unlike Kian's hybrid form, she completed the transformation fully, her wolf emerging in its entirety, silver white and lithe, smaller than his, but no less powerful in presence. Her wolf was the embodiment of grace and lethal precision, and it bore the faint, nearly healed scar of a severed mate mark across its shoulder. She saw recognition and horror flare through Kian's eyes as he noticed that scar. He understood immediately what it meant, that her mark had been forcibly removed, that she had been rejected by her pack, that she had suffered in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He took a step toward her, his posture changing from dominance to something approaching desperation. "Who hurt you?" he demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Who dared to mark you and then tear the mark away? Tell me, and I will hunt them across the earth itself and—" "Stop," she said, her wolf's voice strange and beautiful, like wind through ancient canyons. She shifted back to human form to address him properly, and he mirrored the change, revealing his massive human form in all its terrifying, intoxicating beauty. They stood perhaps 10 paces apart, and the distance felt like both an ocean and nothing at all. "You don't know me," Lyra said quietly. "You don't know what I've become, what I've had to do to survive. You only know the bond. You're reacting to the bond, the way any alpha reacts when discovering his fated mate." "That's not true," Kian said, shaking his head. "I've felt you in my dreams every night for 5 years. I've felt your pain, your desperation, your absolute refusal to surrender even when everything should have crushed you. That's not just the bond talking, Lyra. That's me. That's my soul recognizing my mate." At hearing her name spoken in his voice, deep and raw and filled with such desperate longing, Lyra felt something inside her begin to crack. "5 years ago," she said, and her voice shook, "I was marked on the night of the blood moon. I belonged to you, had been chosen by the moon goddess to be your mate. And when my own pack saw the mark, when they understood who my fated mate was, do you know what they did?" Kian's expression hardened. He shook his head, waiting. "They rejected me," she whispered. "My alpha tore the mark from my shoulder with his claws. He called me cursed. He said no true king would ever claim filth like me. And then I ran into the storm, bleeding and broken and utterly alone. And I made a choice. I would never again depend on anyone else's judgment to tell me my worth. I would build my own strength, create my own destiny, and I would become someone who could stand as an equal to the man the moon goddess had chosen for me. Kian stepped forward, and she didn't pull away. "I should have found you sooner," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I felt our bond forming, felt the moment you were claimed, felt the exact second someone tore you from me. It nearly destroyed me. The only thing that kept me sane was the knowledge that you were alive somewhere, that I could still feel your presence like a pull in my chest. Every night, I would sleep hoping to find you in the dream space, hoping to understand where you were." "I found myself," Lyra said, but there was no anger in her voice now, only exhaustion. "I built something from nothing. I took broken wolves and gave them purpose. I became the ghost wolf, and I did it without your help, or your crown, or your protection." "I know," Kian said, and his eyes held such respect, such acknowledgement of her strength, that something inside Lyra began to shatter. "I know, and I'm awed by it. But Lyra, you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. That's what mates are for, to share the burden, to stand together when the world tries to break you apart." He extended his hand to her across the space that separated them, a gesture of offering, of vulnerability. Lyra looked at his hand for a long moment. Every instinct was screaming at her to refuse, to maintain the walls she had built, to never again make herself vulnerable to the potential of rejection. But as she looked into his gold eyes, as she felt the desperate honesty pouring from him across the bond that was suddenly, impossibly, coming back to life, she found that she couldn't refuse. She stepped forward and took his hand. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded. Cliffhanger. The bond reignited with such force that both of them gasped, their eyes flaring bright, his gold, hers silver, as the connection that had been severed so brutally was renewed and strengthened. But in that same moment, a scream split the air from the courtyard. One of Lyra's rogues came running toward them, fear etched across her features. "Alpha King!" she cried. "Messengers from the Bloodfang pack approach under flag of truce. They carry news. The old Alpha is dead, and the pack has split into civil war. They're requesting your intervention." But that wasn't the worst of it. Chapter 5. The Chains of the Past. The Obsidian Keep was unlike anything Lyra had ever experienced. The fortress she had known as her home for 5 years was functional, stripped down to bare necessity. But the Alpha King's castle was an architectural marvel, soaring towers of black stone that seemed to pierce the very heavens, massive halls carved from living rock, passages illuminated by enchanted luminescent stones that cast everything in a soft, ethereal glow. It was a place of power and beauty and history, and it made Lyra feel smaller than she had ever felt, even when she was labelled Omega. She stood in the grand hall of the keep, surrounded by wolves in armour bearing the insignia of the royal pack. Above her, the vaulted ceiling stretched impossibly high, decorated with murals that told the history of the Lycan kingdoms. Below her feet, the stone was polished so smooth that it reflected the light like still water. And around her, the whispers followed like a plague. "A rogue Omega," she heard someone murmur to their companion. "The Alpha King has brought a rogue Omega into the keep itself. Not just any rogue, the Ghost Wolf herself, the one who's been stirring up the rabble, giving rogues ideas about independence and power. She's unkempt. Look at her clothes, her hair. She hasn't been to a proper gathering in her entire life. What could the king possibly see in her?" Lyra kept her posture rigid, her expression controlled. She had spent 5 years building herself into someone untouchable, someone separate from the society that had rejected her. She had made peace with being an outsider, had even celebrated it. But now, standing in this hall of power, She found that old wounds were opening up again, the wounds of shame and humiliation that had driven her into the wastelands in the first place. Kian emerged from a private chamber, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. Every wolf in the hall straightened, respectful silence falling like a curtain. The Alpha King's presence was impossible to ignore. It filled the space like a tangible force, bending reality around itself through sheer weight of authority and power. He crossed directly to Lyra and took her hand, a gesture of absolute public claim that sent another ripple of shock through the assembled wolves. "My council wishes to discuss the matter of the rogue packs," he said, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. "They believe your integration into our society requires formal procedures. But before we address that, I believe you deserve rest. You've been traveling for days." It was a kindness, she understood. An acknowledgement that she didn't have to face the scrutiny of his council today, not when she was exhausted and overwhelmed. But it was also, she recognized with a sinking feeling in her stomach, an avoidance. In his chambers that night, Kian held her as she struggled with the enormity of the situation. They had claimed the mate bond officially now, performed the ceremonial binding that marked them as fated mates in the eyes of the Lycan law. They had drunk from a shared chalice, exchanged blood, spoken vows under the watchful eyes of the moon goddess. But Lyra was beginning to understand that claiming a bond and truly accepting one were two entirely different things. "The whispers," she said quietly into the darkness. "The other wolves don't believe I deserve to stand at your side." Kian's arms tightened around her. "What do I care what they believe? You are my fated mate. By law and by the bonds of nature itself, you are where you belong. That's not how bonds work," Lyra said, pulling back slightly to look at him. "You can't force a bond through law or decree. Everyone in that hall is watching me, waiting for me to prove I'm worthy of being Luna. And I'm not certain I am." "Lyra!" "I'm serious," she interrupted. 5 years ago, I was marked, and my own pack rejected me. What if they were right? What if there's something in me that can't be fixed, that can't be elevated, that will always remain tainted by that original rejection?" Kian shifted, his golden eyes catching the light of the moon streaming through the windows. "Then we are both tainted," he said quietly. "Because for 5 years, I felt that rejection too. Every moment that our bond lay severed, every night when I woke from dreams of you, I felt the weight of that rejection. But that rejection came not from us, but from those too small to understand us." He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Lyra, listen to me carefully. You are not broken. You are not corrupted by what happened. You are the strongest wolf I have ever encountered, and I say that not because you're my mate, but because it's the truth. You took a wound that should have destroyed you and transmuted it into something that built an empire of the forgotten. That's not weakness. That's transcendence." She wanted to believe him. Gods, how she wanted to believe him. But 5 years of independence had made her cautious, had made her refuse to trust anything that came too easily. And this, being claimed by the most powerful wolf in existence, being declared Luna, being given everything she thought she wanted, it came too easily. The next morning, she discovered why. The council met in a private chamber, and Lyra was invited to attend. A break with tradition that caused raised eyebrows among the assembled nobles and war leaders. Around a massive table of black marble, 10 of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom prepared to discuss what they saw as a problem. Seraphine Vale arrived fashionably late, and when she did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, elegant and deadly, with pale skin and hair the color of spun silver. Her eyes were a striking shade of ice blue, and she wore the armor and insignia of a high-ranking alpha, daughter of the Valamont Pack, one of the oldest and most prestigious houses in the kingdom. And she was looking at Lyra with the kind of hatred that could burn kingdoms to ash. "So this is the rogue we've heard so much about," Seraphine said, her voice dripping with venom. "How quaint. The ghost wolf, legend of the wastelands, standing here looking like she's about to bolt at any moment. Tell me, girl, did you truly believe the Alpha King would accept you as his Luna? That he would actually bind himself to someone of your caliber?" Lyra forced herself to remain calm. "I don't believe anything about what others think. I know only that the bond between the Alpha King and myself is acknowledged by the moon goddess herself." "The bond?" Seraphine laughed, a crystalline sound like breaking glass. "Yes, the bond. But bonds can be broken, can't they? Or perhaps never formed properly in the first place. Tell me, does everyone in this room know why the Alpha King's bond to you was severed 5 years ago?" All eyes turned to Lyra. She felt Kian tense beside her, felt his hand reaching for hers in a gesture of support and claim. But she pulled away slightly because she needed to face this alone. She had learned long ago that showing vulnerability to predators only encouraged them to attack. "My original pack rejected me," Lyra said coolly. "My alpha tore the mark from my shoulder." "Indeed," Seraphine said, settling into a chair with deliberate slowness. "And don't you find it curious that the moon goddess would mark you as the mate of the most powerful wolf in existence, only to have that mark rejected by your own people? One might think the moon goddess made a mistake. One might think that perhaps the bond was never meant to take hold." "The moon goddess does not make mistakes," Kian said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made even the council members flinch. "Does she not?" Seraphine's smile turned predatory. "Then explain to me why my own family has been offering bride prices and alliance treaties for the past century. Why the Valamont Pack has been in negotiation to bond me to the crown since my birth. And why that bond was set aside without explanation or compensation when a rogue from the wastelands suddenly appeared." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. "You were promised," Lyra said quietly, understanding flooding through her. "The Alpha King and you were betrothed." "We were," Seraphine confirmed, her smile never wavering. "An arrangement of mutual benefit. My family brings resources and political stability. The king brings prestige and power. It's how these things work in the civilized world. But apparently, a fated mate claim supersedes years of carefully negotiated agreements. How very romantic, and how very problematic for all of us." Kian stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. "The betrothal is voided. The moon goddess has spoken through the claiming of Lyra as my mate. No political arrangement supersedes the natural law." "Natural law?" Seraphine repeated softly. "How fascinating that you should invoke that now, when for 5 years you violated the most basic natural law. The law that says fated mates recognize each other, claim each other, complete their bond. Yet somehow, you and your precious Lyra failed to do any of that until she appeared in the Blackthorn Ravine, leading an army of rogues. One might almost think the original rejection was fate's way of telling you something." Cliffhanger. Before Kian could respond, General Vex burst into the chamber without ceremony, his face pale and urgent. "Your Majesty," he said breathlessly, "the Bloodfang Pack has mobilized their full military forces. They've declared your Omega claim null and void, stating that as the pack that originally rejected her, they have the legal right to dispute her mate bond. They're marching toward the keep as we speak, and they're not coming to negotiate. They're coming to reclaim what they call the defective wolf who shames our bloodline. And if we refuse to surrender her to them— He paused, his voice dropping. They've allied with 3 neighboring packs. We're looking at the largest wolf rebellion in 50 years. The council believes you must choose: surrender Lyra to maintain peace or prepare for war. Chapter 6. The Rival Luna. War was not unfamiliar to Lyra, but there was a difference between surviving skirmishes with rogue hunters and engaging in full-scale conflict with established packs. The Bloodfang forces numbered in the thousands, warriors who had trained their entire lives within structured hierarchies. Against them, Lyra had her rogues, experienced survivors, but not military forces in any formal sense. She stood with Kian on the battlements of the Obsidian Keep, looking down at the gathered forces below. The Bloodfang pack had positioned their armies in a siege formation, with 3 allied packs arranged on their flanks. The message was clear: surrender Lyra, or be overwhelmed. I'll go to them, Lyra said quietly. I'll surrender myself. Your people shouldn't go to war because of me. Absolutely not, Kian said flatly. If you think I'm letting you walk into that encampment after what they did to you, after what they tore from us, then you've underestimated my capacity for rage. Behind them, General Vex cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the Council is requesting your presence. There are negotiations to be conducted. The Bloodfang Alpha is demanding an audience. The war room fell silent as the Bloodfang Alpha was escorted inside. He was not the same wolf who had tore the mark from Lyra's shoulder 5 years ago. That Alpha had apparently died under mysterious circumstances, leaving the pack in chaos. This new Alpha was younger, perhaps in his early 50s in human years, with the bearing of someone who had fought his way to power. His name was Kale Bloodfang, and he looked at Lyra with the kind of contempt reserved for something that had crawled up from beneath the earth. The rogue, he said, his voice carrying the accent of the Northern Territories. The shame of our bloodline returns, this time claiming to be Luna of the Crown. How the mighty have fallen if the Alpha King would accept such broken merchandise. Lyra felt Kian's power spike dangerously beside her, felt his wolf pressing against his human form, desperate to take control and tear this man's throat out. She placed a hand on his arm, a small gesture, but enough to remind him to maintain control. I don't claim anything, Lyra said, her voice steady and level. I am what the Moon Goddess chose me to be. Your pack's rejection of that choice doesn't change the fundamental truth. The Moon Goddess, Kale laughed. A romantic notion for those too stupid to understand that strength is determined by force, not by cosmic whimsy. But we're not here to debate theology. We're here to reclaim what belongs to us. I don't belong to the Bloodfang pack, Lyra said. I ceased to belong to you the moment your previous Alpha tore the mark from my shoulder. I belong now only to myself and to the Alpha King. Then you belong to no one? Seraphine's voice rang out as she entered the war room. She moved with the confidence of someone who had no doubt of their own importance. Because the bond between you and the king is contested, not only by Bloodfang, but by the Council of Elders. If the original pack rejects you, if they contest your bloodline and your right to bear the mark, then the bond becomes questionable. And a questioned bond can be challenged. By whom? Kian demanded, his voice cutting like steel. By anyone with standing, Seraphine said, and her smile was a thing of terrible beauty. And I have standing. I am bonded by family treaty to the Valemont line, one of the original founding houses. I have the right to challenge for the position of Luna, and I challenge now, under the ancient laws of the crown. The implications hung in the chamber like a guillotine blade suspended above everyone's head. A Luna's challenge was an ancient ritual. When multiple wolves contested for the position of Luna beside the Alpha King, they were forced to undergo a series of trials that determined who was most worthy of the position. The trials tested physical strength, mental acuity, magical affinity, and, most critically, the depth and purity of their bond with the Alpha King. Most Lunas won these challenges through combat. Some won through displays of strategic brilliance, and the rarest ones won through demonstrations of love so pure and powerful that the moon goddess herself confirmed the bond. Seraphine, Lyra understood with a sinking feeling, was planning to win through combat. "I accept your challenge," Lyra said before Kian could speak. "Lyra," Kian began, but she cut him off with a look. "If I run from this, if I retreat or hide behind your power, then every whisper that was spoken in your halls will be confirmed as truth. I will always be seen as the rogue who couldn't hold her place, who had to be protected by her mate. But if I face her, if I defeat her, then there's no question about my right to stand at your side." The challenge trials were set to begin at dawn, and Lyra spent that night preparing her body and her mind. She ran through combat forms, practiced her shifting, meditated on the strength that had sustained her through 5 years of exile in the wastelands. But it was Kian who found her as midnight approached. He pulled her close, and she let herself be held, let herself feel the desperate protectiveness radiating from him. "I don't want you to do this," he said quietly. "Seraphine has been trained in formal combat her entire life. She has advantages." "I have advantages too," Lyra interrupted. "I have experience. I have survival instinct. And I have something she'll never have: actual need. She's fighting for pride and for power. I'm fighting for my life and for the chance to stand beside you without apology." He kissed her then, deeply, completely, pouring every ounce of his desperation and love into that contact. And when they drew apart, his eyes held a promise. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. The bond between us doesn't exist because the council approves it or because a trial confirms it. It exists because we choose it. Never forget that." Cliffhanger. The next morning, as Lyra prepared to enter the trial arena, a messenger arrived from the Moon Court, the ancient council of mystical wolves who served the moon goddess directly. They had learned of the challenge and had decided to send a representative to oversee the trials personally. But the representative that emerged from the mist was someone Lyra never expected to see: her grandmother, the woman who had raised her in the Bloodfang pack before dying when Lyra was only 8 years old. Except this woman was exactly as she had been in that old memory, neither aged nor diminished, speaking with a voice that seemed to echo across dimensions. "Child," the grandmother said, her eyes holding ancient knowledge, "the trials you are about to face are not what you expect. The moon goddess has chosen to intervene in this matter, but to confirm your bond, you must face not just Seraphine, but also the shadow of your own past, the rejection that nearly destroyed you. Are you prepared?" Chapter 7. The Trial of the Moon. The trial arena had been constructed in the ancient amphitheatre beneath the Obsidian Keep, a space that had not been used in living memory. The walls were carved with symbols that glowed faintly with silver light, the language of the moon goddess herself. At the center of the arena, 2 circles had been drawn, one for Lyra, one for Seraphine. The crowd that gathered was enormous. Thousands of wolves from every pack in the kingdom had come to witness the trial. It was not merely a test of combat, but a test of worthiness, a verification that the moon goddess had chosen well in selecting Lyra as Luna. Seraphine entered first, moving with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. She wore armor that had been woven with magical threads, protective enchantments that would absorb some of the impact from blows. Her eyes were cold and certain. She had defeated every challenger before, and she saw no reason why this ragged rogue would be different. Lyra entered second, and the crowd's reaction was immediate and telling. There was no armor, no enchantments. She wore only the simple clothing she had lived in for 5 years, functional, practical, bearing the scars of 1,000 small battles. Her body, when visible, showed the marks of genuine struggle, scars, old wounds, the physical evidence of someone who had survived against impossible odds. The grandmother stood between them, and her voice carried the weight of divinity. "The trial of the moon has 3 components," she announced. "First, the trial of combat. Second, the trial of revelation. Third, the trial of sacrifice. Only the winner of all 3 may claim the position of Luna." "But first," the grandmother continued, and her eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that was almost unbearable, "you must face the shadow of your rejection." The arena shifted. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow deeper, more substantial. And suddenly, Lyra was no longer standing in the amphitheatre. She was standing in the hall of the Bloodfang packhouse on the night of her humiliation, surrounded by jeering faces. Seraphine vanished. The grandmother vanished. Only Lyra remained, facing the phantoms of her past. "Cursed," the shadow voices whispered. "Broken, unworthy. No king would ever claim you." And she saw her old alpha stepping forward, his claws raised, his face twisted with hatred. She felt the mark being torn from her shoulder, felt the anguish of the severed bond like a blade through her heart. But this time, she didn't run. This time, she stood her ground and felt the full weight of that pain. And instead of letting it destroy her, she channeled it. She let it flow through her like a river, transforming it from anguish into power, from trauma into strength. The scars on her shoulder, both the old one and the psychological one, became proof, not of her weakness, but of her resilience, not of her unworthiness, but of her unbreakable will. "I was broken," Lyra said aloud, addressing the shadows directly. "I was rejected and cast out and left to die in a storm, and I survived. Not because the rejection never happened, but because I refused to let it define me. The scar you left on my shoulder is a badge of my power, not a mark of my shame." The shadows dissipated like smoke, and Lyra stood once more in the arena, facing Seraphine. The other woman looked startled, as if she had been pulled from her own trial and thrust back into the moment of combat. The grandmother nodded slightly. "The trial of shadow is past. Now, the trial of combat." Seraphine came at her like a hurricane, all grace and trained technique. She was faster than Lyra, stronger by the measure of raw physical power, more skilled in the formal disciplines of combat. But Lyra had something Seraphine didn't have. 5 years of desperate, actual survival. Every move Seraphine made was one Lyra had encountered in real combat. Every technique the nobility-trained wolf deployed was one that Lyra had learned to counter with minimal resources. And more importantly, Lyra didn't fight to look impressive or to demonstrate superiority. She fought with absolute clarity of purpose, neutralize the threat, and emerge victorious. Seraphine was trying to defeat Lyra. Lyra was trying to survive Seraphine. It was the difference between fighting as sport and fighting as necessity. They collided in the center of the arena, both partially shifted, both drawing on their wolf forms for strength and speed. Seraphine's armor deflected most of Lyra's initial strikes, but Lyra had learned to look for weakness in every defense. She found them and exploited them, moving with the precision of someone who had spent 5 years in life-or-death struggles. The crowd roared, but Lyra heard nothing. Her world had narrowed to Seraphine's movements, to the rhythm of combat, to the moment-by-moment calculation of survival. Seraphine made a mistake. It was small, a slight telegraphing of a strike, a moment where her balance shifted fractionally too far forward. But it was enough. Lyra pivoted, using Seraphine's own momentum against her, and drove her opponent to the ground. She held Seraphine down, her hand pressed to the other woman's throat, demonstrating control and victory without pressing hard enough to truly harm. The grandmother raised her hand. The trial of combat is concluded. Lyra is victorious, but Seraphine was still struggling, her eyes burning with rage and humiliation. And in that struggle, Lyra felt something unexpected, not triumph, but sympathy. Seraphine had been trained her entire life to compete, to win, to dominate. The revelation that she could lose was clearly destroying something fundamental in her worldview. Lyra released her. It was an act of mercy that cost her nothing and everything. It demonstrated power more clearly than any victory could. True strength didn't need to dominate the defeated. The final trial, the grandmother announced, is the trial of sacrifice. The arena transformed once more. Lyra found herself standing in a void, facing a mirror image of herself. But this reflection was different. It was her old self, the girl she had been before rejection, before exile, before 5 years of building strength from nothing. To claim your bond, the voice of the goddess spoke through her grandmother, you must choose between the life you have built and the life you might have had. You must sacrifice one to keep the other. Choose wisely. Lyra looked at her reflection, and for a moment she felt the weight of that impossible choice. The life she had built was real. It was hers. It meant something. But the life she might have had, acceptance, belonging, love freely given, also meant something. They were both precious, both worthy of preservation. And in that moment, Lyra understood. The trial wasn't asking her to choose between them. It was asking her to understand that she didn't have to. I choose both, Lyra said quietly. I choose to carry the scar of my rejection alongside the strength it gave me. I choose to keep the life I built in the wastelands while also embracing the future that's being offered to me. I don't sacrifice my past. I integrate it. I own it. And I refuse to be diminished by it. The mirror shattered, and Lyra found herself back in the arena, with her grandmother nodding slowly. Around her, the crowd was silent, waiting. The trials are complete, the grandmother announced. Lyra Thorne has proven herself worthy in shadow, in combat, and in sacrifice. The moon goddess confirms her bond to the Alpha King. Let it be known throughout all the kingdoms. This is Luna. Cliffhanger. But as the crowd began to celebrate, as Lyra was moving toward where Kian stood, the grandmother's expression changed. The ancient woman looked upward, her eyes going distant, and Lyra felt a sudden disturbance in the magical currents flowing through the arena. The grandmother turned to Lyra, and her voice was urgent and afraid. Something is coming, she whispered. Something old and angry and very, very powerful. The ceremony has awakened it, an entity bound to the original rejection, a curse placed on your bloodline generations ago. The Valamont family has been harboring a dark magic all this time, and Seraphine was meant to trigger it as a failsafe. The trial was never supposed to be about combat. It was supposed to bring about your death and destroy the king's bloodline in the process. We have very little time. Chapter 8. The Fall of Bloodfang. The news of Lyra's victory as Luna spread like wildfire through the kingdoms. But it was not an unqualified triumph. The Bloodfang pack, seeing that their plan to reclaim her had failed, had begun mobilizing their forces for direct attack, and they were not alone. Seraphine had vanished from the keep in the aftermath of her defeat, and her absence carried its own sinister weight. General Vex had discovered evidence of correspondence between the Valamont family and certain factions within the old Bloodfang leadership. Correspondence that suggested coordinated plans dating back years. It was Lyra who made the decision to go to Bloodfang. "I'm going back to where this started," she declared in the war room before Kian could stop her. "I'm going to face the wolves who rejected me and force them to make a choice. Accept the bond the moon goddess has confirmed, or face the wrath of the crown." "That's suicide," one of the generals protested. "You'll be walking into enemy territory." "No," Lyra interrupted. "I'll be walking into my home. Regardless of what the Bloodfang pack did to me, that land shaped me. Those wolves, however much they hurt me, made me who I am. And I need to face them, not as the rogue who fled in shame, but as the Luna who survived everything they tried to destroy me with." Kian wanted to go with her. Every instinct of his wolf demanded that he protect his mate, that he stand beside her in any challenge. But Lyra refused. "This is something I have to do alone," she said. "If you come with your armies and your power, then I'm still hiding behind the Alpha King. But if I go alone, if I face them with only my own strength, then there's no way for them to claim that you forced them to accept me." The ride to Bloodfang territory was long, and Lyra used the time to prepare herself mentally and emotionally. She had spent 5 years in the wastelands, strengthening her body, building her mind, creating herself into something new. But approaching the place of her original humiliation required more than physical or mental preparation. It required spiritual readiness, a willingness to face her past without being consumed by it. She arrived at the Bloodfang pack house at dawn. The wolves that emerged to meet her were numerous but cautious. They recognized her immediately. Few wolves could forget the girl they had rejected on the night of the blood moon. But they didn't recognize her because she was fundamentally changed. The small, delicate girl had been replaced by a woman of grace and lethal precision. The Omega had become something far more dangerous. A wolf who had learned to survive the unsurvivable. Kale Bloodfang emerged last, his face twisted with hatred and something that might have been fear. "So you've come crawling back," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "Does the Alpha King finally tire of his rogue mate? Are you seeking readmission to your proper pack?" "No," Lyra said quietly. "I've come to give you a choice. The moon goddess has confirmed my bond to the Alpha King. The trials have confirmed my worthiness to be Luna, and the law of the realm now requires that all packs acknowledge this bond or face the consequences of rebellion." "We acknowledge nothing," Castle snarled. "You were rejected by this pack and marked as cursed. That curse cannot be lifted by trials or bonds or pretend crownings. You will always be the broken Omega we—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Lyra moved faster than any wolf should be able to move. 5 years of living on the edge of survival had honed her reflexes to something superhuman. She crossed the distance between them and drove him to his knees before he could react. "Do you remember?" she asked softly, and her voice carried the weight of all those years of suffering. Do you remember how it felt to reject me? To tear the mark from my shoulder? To tell me I was unworthy? Cale gasped for breath, his wolf pressing against his human form as he struggled against her grip. I remember, Lyra continued. Every night for 5 years, I remembered. And I chose not to let that memory destroy me. I chose instead to let it refine me, shape me, make me into something stronger than I ever was before. And now, I'm asking you, will you acknowledge the Alpha King's claim on me? Or will you force him to come here and remind you why he rules all the kingdoms? She released him, and Kyle crumpled to the ground, gasping. The assembled Bloodfang wolves looked at each other. They saw their leader defeated without real combat, his authority stripped away in moments. They understood that challenging the Alpha King over his mate was not a battle they could win. We acknowledge, one of the senior wolves called out. The Bloodfang pack acknowledges the Alpha King's bond to Lyra and accepts her as Luna. One by one, the others echoed the acceptance. By the time Lyra left the pack house, the entire Bloodfang territory had sworn allegiance to her claim. But as she rode back toward the Obsidian Keep, she felt it. A disturbance in the magical currents, a darkness moving beneath the surface of reality. Seraphine was still out there somewhere, and whatever plan the Valamont family had set in motion was far from finished. Cliffhanger. When Lyra arrived back at the keep, she found Kian in the war room, his face pale and grim. There's been an attack, he told her quietly. Magical attack, not military. 3 packs have been cursed, entire populations rendered unable to transform, unable to access their wolf forms. The curse is spreading, moving through the land like a plague. And according to our mages, it originates from a single source, Seraphine. But here's the part that frightens me. The curse can only be lifted by the one who cast it, or by someone offering a blood sacrifice of equal power. Your life for the lives of 3 packs. The realm faces a choice. Chapter 9. The bond renewed. The plague spread like wildfire through 3 territories, rendering hundreds of wolves unable to access their fundamental nature. Without the ability to shift, wolves were vulnerable, weak, human-trapped in a nightmare of helplessness. And the magical signature of the curse bore only one mark: Seraphine Veil. We'll find her, Kian said with fierce determination. We'll hunt her through every kingdom if necessary, and we'll force her to lift the curse. That will take time we don't have, the grandmother said quietly. The ancient woman had remained at the keep, serving as advisor and representative of the Moon Court. The curse is accelerating. Within 3 days, it will reach critical mass. The wolves affected won't merely be unable to shift, they'll lose their magical essence entirely. They'll become human, permanently. And then the curse will spread to other packs, other territories. Within a month, it could render the entire race incapable of transformation. Lyra listened to this, and she felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders. There was one solution, one that the mages had confirmed, though they spoke of it reluctantly: a blood sacrifice. A life of equal magical power freely given could break the curse. I'll do it, Lyra said simply. The room erupted. Absolutely not! Kian roared, his power spiking so intensely that several of the generals actually fell to their knees. I will find another way. I will tear through every dimension if I have to, but you will not sacrifice yourself. Why not? Lyra asked calmly. I have the power to save hundreds of thousands of wolves. How can I justify choosing not to when the cost is my own life? Because you're my mate. Kian's voice was raw with anguish. Because I've only just found you. Because losing you would break something in me that can never be repaired. Lyra crossed to him and took his hands. And that's exactly why I have to do this, she said gently, not despite our bond, but because of it. A true mate doesn't sacrifice the other at the altar of their love. They learn to transcend that love, to expand it to encompass something larger. You taught me that when you found me in the wastelands. You showed me that love doesn't diminish when it encompasses more than just the beloved. Let me do the same. There's another way, the grandmother said suddenly. Both Lyra and Kian turned to her. The ancient woman's eyes were distant, as if she were consulting with forces beyond their perception. The curse is born of dark magic, yes, but it's also born of emotional poison, Seraphine's rage and jealousy given form. There is a ritual, an ancient one, that can transform that poison into power instead of destruction, but it requires a sacrifice of a different kind. What kind? Kian demanded. The sacrifice of the bond itself, the grandmother said quietly, temporarily. The blood sacrifice requires that the Luna and the king voluntarily sever their mate bond, offering that severing as the price to break Seraphine's curse. But to do so permanently would be tragic. Instead, the ritual allows for a temporary severance. For a time, they would be disconnected from each other, unable to feel the bond, unable to sense each other across distance. But if they survive that separation and choose to renew the bond afterward, it will return stronger than ever, reinforced by the sacrifice made. Kian looked at Lyra, and she saw the calculation running through his mind. How long? He asked. How long would the bond be severed? As long as it takes for her to reclaim you, the grandmother said. The severance is not passive. The Luna and King must actively choose, at the moment of separation, to find each other again. Only then can the bond be renewed. It could be days. It could be years. No one can say. Lyra felt her heart clench at this information. To lose the bond, to lose that connection that had become so fundamental to her existence, even temporarily, felt like a second death. But she also understood what was being asked of her. Faith. Faith that what she and Kian had built was strong enough to survive even the severance of the mystical connection that bound them. I consent to the ritual, she said. So do I, Kian said, though the words clearly cost him greatly. The ceremony took place in the ancient temple beneath the keep, in a space so old that mortar between the stones had turned to dust, and the symbols carved into the walls had worn nearly smooth with age. The grandmother prepared the ritual space with precise movements, laying out components that glowed with eldritch power. At the center of the circle, Lyra and Kian stood facing each other. Around them, the greatest mages of the realm formed a secondary circle, their power ready to amplify and direct the ritual. This severing is a severance of connection but not of essence, the grandmother intoned. When it is done, you will no longer sense each other. You will no longer feel the bond pulling you together, but the love that created that bond, that remains. Love is not the same as the mate connection. Love is a choice, renewed moment by moment. The connection is fate. But love is something we create ourselves. Lyra took Kian's hands one final time before the bond was severed. His gold eyes met her silver ones, and in that moment they poured everything into that contact. All their love, all their longing, all their promise. Find me, she whispered. Always, he replied. Then the grandmother spoke the words of severance, and the world exploded into light. When Lyra's vision cleared, she felt it immediately. the absence. The bond that had become such an integral part of her consciousness that she barely noticed it was gone. She couldn't feel Kian's presence anymore, couldn't sense his emotions or his location, couldn't hear the echo of his thoughts at the edge of her mind. It was like losing half of herself. She looked across the circle and saw that Kian was on his knees, his face a mask of anguish. He was experiencing the same emptiness, the same devastating absence. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw the raw pain in his gaze. Then the magic of the ritual pulled them apart, and she was transported away, far from the obsidian keep, to a place where she would have to find her own way back. The ritual was complete. The bond was severed, and somewhere in the territories of the realm, Seraphine's curse shattered like glass, the dark magic consuming itself as the sacrifice took hold. Cliffhanger. Lyra found herself alone in a forest she didn't recognize, with no connection to Kian, no way to sense where he was, or if he was thinking of her. Around her, she could feel the curse breaking. The 3 packs that had been afflicted suddenly finding their transformations restored, their magical essence returning. But as she began to move, trying to orient herself, she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. "Well, well, well," Seraphine said, stepping out from behind a tree with a blade in her hand. "It seems the ritual worked exactly as I planned. The bond is severed, the king is alone and grieving, and you are here, defenseless and without the protection of your mate. I may have lost the trial, but I haven't lost the war. In fact, I've only just begun." Chapter 10. The Lunar's Coronation. 3 months. For 3 months, Lyra wandered the territories, pursued by Seraphine and the remnants of the Valamont forces. For 3 months, she survived on instinct and cunning and the absolute refusal to be captured or killed. She used every skill she had learned in the wastelands, moving through forests and mountains, always one step ahead of her hunters. But she was also searching. She used every technique she had developed as the ghost wolf to gather information about Kian's movements, about his state of mind, about whether he was looking for her or had given up hope. The reports she received were contradictory. Some claimed the Alpha King had declared war on the Valamont pack. Others said he was in his chambers, refusing to see anyone. Still others whispered that he was slowly going mad from the loss of the bond. And then, on a night when the moon was full and Lyra was weak from hunger and exhaustion, she found him. He was tracking her through the mountains, his wolf form massive and silver-black against the snow, his eyes burning with desperate determination. He had found her trail not through magical connection, but through sheer persistence, following her path across 3 territories, reading the signs that only someone who knew her deeply could understand. She shifted to her human form and stepped out of the shadows. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Kian shifted to human form as well, and when their eyes met, something inside both of them seemed to shift into alignment. "I found you," he said, his voice raw. "You did," she agreed, "and I chose to be found." The bond didn't instantly reconnect. The magic of the ritual required conscious choice from both parties. But as they came together, as their hands met and their bodies connected, they made that choice simultaneously. The mate bond exploded back into existence with such force that both of them gasped, their eyes flaring bright, his gold, hers silver, as the connection rushed back into their consciousness like water breaking through a dam. It was more intense than before, reinforced by the sacrifice, strengthened by the separation. It was a bond renewed not through fate alone, but through choice and love, and the active decision to find each other again. Kian pulled her close, and Lyra held him like she would never let go. "I will never," he whispered against her hair, "let anything separate us again." "We may not have a choice," she said softly, "but we'll face whatever comes together." They returned to the obsidian keep to find the kingdom in the midst of celebrating. The curse had been broken, the territories had been restored, and most importantly, the Alpha King's mate had been proven worthy of her position in every conceivable way. The people of the realm had watched as their Luna survived every trial, faced every challenge, and ultimately saved her own people through an act of sacrifice so profound that it had become the stuff of legend. The coronation took place in the great hall of the keep, with representatives from every pack in attendance. The grandmother of the Moon Court performed the ceremony, and when Lyra's crown was placed upon her head, it was not with reluctance or hesitation. The wolves that surrounded them were seeing for the first time not a rogue or an omega, but a true Luna, a wolf who had earned her position through strength and sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to be diminished by those who had tried to destroy her. Kian stood at her side, and when she looked at him, she saw pride and love and a bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "I have a gift for you," Kian said later that night, when they were finally alone in their private chambers. He presented her with something wrapped in cloth of silver and moonlight. When she unwrapped it, she found a weapon, a sword of remarkable craftsmanship, its blade inscribed with runes that glowed softly in the darkness. But it wasn't the weapon itself that made her breath catch. It was the inscription along the fuller of the blade. It read, "For the ghost wolf, who was rejected by her pack and loved by the moon goddess. May this blade remind you that even the smallest howl can awaken a kingdom." Lyra ran her fingers over the inscription, and tears slipped down her cheeks. "I want to establish something," she said quietly. "A formal order of wolves dedicated to helping the rejected and the outcast. We can use the rogue territories as a base, create a true sanctuary for wolves who have been cast out by society. Will you support that?" Kian smiled. "I'll do better than support it," he said. "I'll help you build it." That night, under the full moon, they made love with the ferocity of two wolves who had nearly lost each other and chose to celebrate the miracle of finding each other again. The bond between them sang with power and certainty, and when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, Lyra felt something she had never thought to feel. Complete. Cliffhanger. But as dawn approached, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The kingdom's borders had detected an incursion, something moving through the dimensional barriers that protected the Lycan realm from outside forces. It was large, powerful, and ancient, and according to the seers, it was heading directly toward the keep. The message was simple, but terrifying. The Old Ones wake. The human world awakens to your existence. War is coming from outside the kingdoms, and your realm has perhaps 7 days before the barriers fall completely. Chapter 11. The King and his Omega. The threat was unprecedented. For thousands of years, the Lycan realm had existed in a state of protected isolation, hidden from the human world by magical barriers that kept the two species separate. But something had changed. Something had damaged those barriers, and now the ancient gates were failing. Lyra stood in the war room with Kian and his generals, looking at the reports that were arriving hourly. The incursion wasn't military in the traditional sense. It was something older and stranger, entities that seemed to exist partially outside of normal reality, things that the most experienced mages struggled to even identify. "These are primordial creatures," one of the elders said, his voice shaking. entities from before the lichens even existed as a species. They're attracted to magical power, and our realm has been broadcasting our existence like a beacon. The ritual, Lyra said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. The ritual where we severed and renewed the bond. It was incredibly powerful magic. We would have been visible across the dimensional barriers for a brief time. Which means Seraphine knew, Kian said grimly. Which means she may have deliberately targeted the barriers with her curse, weakening them deliberately. They found Seraphine hiding in a cave system in the northern reaches, and when confronted, she didn't deny it. The Valamont family has served the Old Ones for generations, she said, her face twisted with fanatic devotion. We are their chosen servants in this realm. When the Alpha King rejected the betrothal and took a rogue as his mate, he violated the ancient compact. We had no choice but to summon the Old Ones and invite them to reclaim the lands they once ruled. Kian's wolf surged toward the surface, eager for vengeance, but Lyra placed a hand on his arm. No, she said quietly. We need her alive. If the Old Ones listen to her, if she has any connection to them at all, we might be able to negotiate. What followed was a desperate diplomatic mission. Lyra, Kian, the grandmother from the Moon Court, and a contingent of their strongest warriors met the primordial entities at the border of their realm. What they found was both terrifying and unexpectedly reasonable. The Old Ones were beings of immense power and ancient memory. They had ruled before the lichens, before humans, in an age when magic flowed through reality like water, and the world was a fundamentally different place. When the lichen race had emerged, the Old Ones had been pushed back, their power diminished, their territories reduced. We do not seek destruction, the eldest of the beings said, its voice like mountains grinding against each other. We seek balance. Your kind has dominated for millennia. The compact demands that we be restored to equal standing. Allow us access to a portion of your territories, acknowledge our power, and we will seal the barriers once more. It was, Lyra realized, not a demand for war, but a demand for justice. The Old Ones had been wronged, pushed aside, forgotten, and they were simply asking to be acknowledged. I accept your terms, Kian said, under one condition. The territories we grant you must be offered willingly by the packs who inhabit them. We will not force displacement. But I believe there are many wolves who would see value in living in harmony with such ancient power. Negotiations took 3 days, but by the end of those 3 days, a new compact had been forged. The Old Ones would receive territories in the northernmost reaches of the realm, territories that had been wild and dangerous and relatively unpopulated. In exchange, they would restore the dimensional barriers and extend their power to strengthen them, making incursion from the human world impossible for centuries to come. Seraphine, stripped of her position and her family's influence, was offered a choice: exile or service. She chose service, agreeing to work as a liaison between the Lichen realm and the Old Ones, a role that would keep her far from Kian and Lyra, but would allow her to maintain some semblance of purpose. When peace was finally established and the immediate threats neutralized, Lyra stood with Kian on the balcony of the Obsidian Keep, looking out over the lands they ruled. I was rejected by my pack, she said quietly, and cast out into the wastelands. I was told I was cursed, that no one would ever want me. But I survived that rejection. I built something from nothing. And because I survived it, because I refused to be destroyed by it, I was able to show an entire realm that those rejected by society can become its greatest strength. Kian pulled her close. I've been thinking about establishing something, he said, a new order of knights dedicated to protecting wolves who are being hunted or rejected, and I want you to lead it." "The Order of the Rejected," Lyra said softly. "The Order of the Reclaimed," Kian corrected. "Because that's what you are, Lyra. Reclaimed, restored, renewed. And every wolf in that order would be someone like you, someone who was broken and learned to make themselves whole again." Lyra smiled, and the smile was genuine, filled with a joy that had taken her 5 years in the wastelands to earn. Cliffhanger. That night, as they lay together in their chambers, Lyra felt a strange sensation, a pulling in her lower abdomen, a warmth that spread through her entire body. The bond between them glowed brighter, and suddenly she understood. Their first son was coming, a child born of a bond renewed through sacrifice, a wolf who would inherit not just power, but also the knowledge of what it meant to rise from rejection to reclamation. But as she opened her mouth to tell Kian the news, an ancient voice spoke from the shadows of the room, the grandmother from the moon court, her expression grave and knowing. "The child you carry," the grandmother said, "will be marked by prophecy. According to the oldest records, when a Luna and King renew their bond through such profound sacrifice, their firstborn becomes a bridge between worlds, a wolf capable of understanding and communicating with both the human realm and the primordial realm equally. But such power comes with a price. This child will be hunted by those who fear the bridge they represent." Chapter 12. The Future Horizon. Years passed. The rejected Omega's story became legend throughout the kingdoms, whispered around fires, and told to young wolves as a reminder that destiny was not determined by birth or status, but by the choices one made in the face of adversity. Lyra's order grew, the Order of the Reclaimed, attracting wolves who had been cast out, rejected, or broken by the packs that should have protected them. Under her leadership, these wolves were not merely given shelter. They were transformed into warriors, strategists, healers, and leaders who understood intimately the cost of survival. Kian and Lyra had 3 children together. The eldest was a son with his father's silver-black hair and his mother's silver eyes. The prophesied bridge walker who did indeed spend portions of his childhood in the primordial territories, learning the languages and cultures of the old ones. The other 2 were daughters, each remarkable in their own ways, each carrying forward the legacy of their parents' choices. The Bloodfang Pack, under new leadership, had become one of the staunchest allies of the crown. The alpha who had rejected Lyra was long dead, and those who had participated in her humiliation had either left the pack or learned to live with the weight of their shame. Most chose the latter, and over time, the act of Lyra's mercy, her refusal to destroy them despite having the power to do so, became a teaching tool in the pack. Young Bloodfang wolves were taught that true strength came from knowing when not to take vengeance, from understanding that creating new victims never healed the original wound. Seraphine eventually found peace in her service to the old ones. She became a skilled diplomat, and though she and Lyra would never be friends, they developed a respect born from understanding that both had been forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances. Years later, Seraphine would even attend the coronation of Lyra's children, and though her presence was complicated, it was civil. On the anniversary of the first blood moon that marked Lyra's claiming, 20 years after her initial rejection, the entire realm gathered to celebrate. A festival was declared, and wolves from every pack in the kingdom came to the Obsidian Keep to honor their Luna. Lyra stood in the great hall, no longer the trembling girl who had been rejected on the night of shame, but a woman of certainty and strength. She wore robes of silver and black, the colors of both her wolf and her heritage, and a crown of moonlight itself seemed to rest upon her head. She addressed the assembled masses. 20 years ago, I was marked by the moon goddess and rejected by my pack. I was told I was cursed, that I was unworthy of the bond that fate had created for me. For 5 years, I wandered in the wastelands, broken and alone. But I did not remain broken. I chose, moment by moment, to rebuild myself. I chose to transform my pain into strength. And because I made those choices, I was eventually able to stand before all of you, not as a victim of rejection, but as a Luna who understands intimately the cost of being cast aside. To every wolf here who has been rejected, who has been told they are not enough, who has been cast out by their pack or their family, know this. Rejection is not the end of your story. It is not the measure of your worth. It is simply a test of whether you will let others' judgment of you determine your own judgment of yourself. I stand before you as proof that the moon goddess sees what others cannot. She sees our potential, our strength, our capacity for growth. Trust in that. Trust in yourselves. And know that in the order of the reclaimed, you will find others who understand. You will find a pack that celebrates your survival and honors your strength. As Lyra spoke, Kian stepped forward and took her hand. Their bond glowed visibly in that moment, a connection so profound and so real that even those without magical sight could see it, could feel it resonating through the very stones of the keep. "Raise your voices," Lyra cried out, and her voice carried a power that seemed to resonate with the moon itself. "And let your howl be heard across all the kingdoms." And the wolves howled. Every single wolf in that hall, every wolf in the kingdom, every wolf who had ever felt rejected or broken or cast aside, joined their voice to hers. The sound was immense, ancient, powerful. The cry of a people who had learned that even the smallest howl could awaken a kingdom, that even the most rejected among them could rise to become its greatest strength. In that moment, Lyra understood fully what she had become. Not just a Luna, not just a survivor, but a symbol, a living embodiment of the principle that no one is ever truly beyond redemption, that no rejection is ever truly final, that the greatest transformations often emerge from the deepest wounds. The bond between her and Kian hummed with satisfaction and completion. It had survived severance. It had weathered every trial. It had proven itself not merely fate, but a choice renewed every single day. In every moment, they stood together. And as the celebration continued into the night, as wolves danced and feasted and celebrated the woman who had once been rejected and now ruled beside their king, Lyra stepped out onto the balcony and looked at the moon. The blood moon would rise again in a few months. There would be new matings, new bonds, new wolves discovering their fated mates, and some of them would face rejection. Some would face trials. Some would find themselves broken and cast aside. But they would remember Lyra's story. They would remember that rejection was not an ending, but a beginning. They would remember that the moon goddess had chosen them, and no pack, no individual, no circumstance could change that fundamental truth. Kian joined her on the balcony, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked softly. "The rejection, the 5 years in exile, the trials you had to face?" Lyra considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. Of course, she regretted the pain, the suffering, the years of loneliness. But she also understood that those years had transformed her into someone she could never have become otherwise. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. Because without the rejection, I would have remained an omega in my pack, valuable only for my willingness to serve. Without the exile, I would never have discovered my own strength. Without the trials, I would never have truly understood what it means to be worthy of this position. I regret the pain of these things, but not the things themselves. Kian kissed the top of her head. The moon goddess chose well, he said. She gave me exactly what I needed. And as they stood there, watching the moon rise over the kingdoms they ruled, Lyra felt it, the certainty that her story was not ending, but continuing. There were still wolves to save, still broken bonds to heal, still rejected Omegas waiting to be shown that they were far more than their packs had told them they were. But that was a story for another day. Tonight, she simply held on to the man she loved, felt the bond that connected them thrumming with power and certainty, and let herself be grateful for the journey that had brought her here. Epilogue. The Moon's Blessing. 50 years later, the Order of the Reclaimed had grown into a force of remarkable power. It was no longer a refuge for the rejected. It was an institution of honor, sought after by wolves who wanted to serve a greater purpose. Lyra had stepped back from active leadership years ago, allowing her children and their children to guide the Order forward. But her presence was still felt. Her legacy still resonated through every choice the Order made. She and Kian had grown old together, their fur touched with grey, their faces lined with the wisdom of decades lived in partnership. But their bond had only deepened with time. Where once it had been forged in the fire of trial and sacrifice, now it was sustained by the quiet certainty of choosing each other, day after day, for 50 years. On the night of the blood moon that coincided with their 50th anniversary of claiming the mate bond, they stood together in the temple where they had first renewed their connection after the separation. "I've been thinking," Kian said, his voice still strong despite his age, "about writing down our story, so that future generations understand not just the facts of what happened, but the truth of it, the love, the pain, the absolute certainty that drew us together across impossible distances." Lyra smiled. "Yes," she said, "I think that's important. Not for glory or fame, but so that other wolves understand that their rejection doesn't define them, that their pain can be transformed into purpose." An old woman approached them then, not the grandmother from the moon court, but a young wolf Lyra had found in the wastelands 30 years ago, a girl who had been rejected by her pack so violently that she had nearly lost her mind. Under Lyra's care, she had healed. She had joined the Order of the Reclaimed and had risen through its ranks to become one of its most respected healers and teachers. "Luna," the woman said, kneeling respectfully, "I wanted to tell you that I've just taken in a new young wolf." She was rejected by her pack at the time of the blood moon ceremony. They called her cursed, like so many do, but I recognized her immediately as someone with potential. "I wanted you to know that your legacy lives on." Lyra helped the woman to her feet and embraced her. "That's all I've ever wanted," she said quietly. "Not for people to remember me, but for them to remember that rejection doesn't have to be final, that broken things can be mended, that even the moon goddess can see value in those her packs have cast aside." As the woman left, Kian took Lyra's hand and led her to the window of the temple. Outside, the blood moon hung crimson and beautiful in the sky, and they could hear the distant howls of wolves throughout the kingdom. New matings being claimed, new bonds being formed, new stories beginning. "Do you hear that?" Kian asked softly. "Yes," Lyra said. "The symphony of destiny." "No," Kian corrected gently. "The symphony of choice. Each of those wolves howling is making a choice, to accept the bond, to stand with their mate, to move forward into whatever future awaits them. Just as you and I chose, every single day for 50 years, to stand together." Lyra looked up at the moon, and in its face she saw not just a celestial body, but a witness to her journey. A journey that had taken her from shame to strength, from rejection to reclamation, from a broken Omega to a Luna who had changed her entire kingdom. The moon seemed to smile down at her, and Lyra understood that this was the true blessing, not the power or the title or the castle, but the ability to transform pain into purpose, to take the worst that life offered and forge it into something beautiful and strong and true. She squeezed Kian's hand, and he squeezed back. A silent affirmation of 50 years of choices, 50 years of partnership, 50 years of choosing each other moment by moment, day by day, year by year. And as the blood moon watched over the kingdoms, new omegas were being discovered, new rejections were happening, new journeys beginning. But in every one of those stories, somewhere, somehow, the memory of the rejected omega would echo, proof that even the smallest howl can awaken a kingdom, that even the most broken can become whole again, and that the moon goddess sees what others cannot. The end. Author's final note. This story was written for every soul who has ever been told they're too weak, too small, too different, or too broken to be chosen. Lyra's journey reminds us that rejection is not the end of our story. It is often the beginning. The wounds we carry, the rejections we survive, the trials we endure. These are not marks of our unworthiness. They are the evidence of our strength, the proof that we are capable of transcendence. The moon goddess chose well, and so can we. Choose yourself. Choose your strength. Choose to rise. Even the moon hides her brightest child until the night is darkest. But when she finally shines, she illuminates everything.